Maria Fernanda, for many people who participated in the Stockholm Plus 50 conference in 2022, on the 50th anniversary of that first 1972 United Nations Conference on Human Environment, and also for those who participated subsequently in 2015 in the Paris conference, there is a sense that the system that we have in place to address climate change is simply not working. As you very well know, emissions have continued to rise. Even in 2020, in the middle of COVID, there was only a temporary setback in emissions, and once the global economy recovered, we're moving up again. Of course, the war in Ukraine itself created a kind of an energy crisis. We don't need to get into the details of that, they're quite well known. But one consequence of that is that many countries began to talk about energy security, and you saw in some places carbon capacity that had been mothballed being brought back into production, right? And of course, you have seen what has happened with the weather, the rising temperatures, forest fires, and so on in 2023, which have created the sense of we are in the middle of a huge mess, right? And so my question to you to begin this conversation is basically, is there a way out? Or does it look increasingly like we are on a kind of escalating environmental breakdown, with all the very undesirable consequences that is likely to entail?
Well, and to add to the long list of evidence, Augusto, showing that we're not doing our job right, is what we experienced. 2023, you mentioned, 2023 has been the hottest year in centuries. And we have seen the suffering of people that have no access to cooling, to air conditioning, people that have died because of that. And I'm not speaking about the so-called global south, I'm speaking about European countries. So you really wonder, why is it that we're not acting? Because we have the knowledge, more and more sophisticated capacity of science to measure and see what is happening with the atmosphere and with the chemical composition of the atmosphere. We have the technologies, and renewable technologies, low carbon technologies, renewable energies are cheaper and cheaper. No? So we have the knowledge, we have the technologies, we have the frameworks, because we have a UN Convention on Climate Change. We have made several decisions, including the Paris Agreement in 2015 that you mentioned. So why is it not working? That's your question. And there are no simple answers to that. But I would try, I would mention three issues. The first issue is that climate change is not an environmental problem only. It is a geopolitical problem. Climate change brings together all the geopolitical tensions, because you don't negotiate decreasing emissions or adapting to climate change. You are negotiating development models. You are negotiating lifestyles. You are negotiating production and consumption patterns. So to make the big jump that we need, to transform the way you produce and consume, to transform the pathway to development, to transform your exports for countries that depend on oil and gas exports for their GDP, like my own country, Ecuador. What are the alternatives in place? Easy to say, difficult to do, especially when the prices of oil, because of the war in Ukraine, are going up. So you have that first problem, that this environmental challenge of climate change is geopolitical, and you're negotiating something bigger, than decreasing emissions. Number two, I would say that it's a cultural issue. We are living a model, an economic model, that basically encourages overconsumption and links well-being with having and having more. I think that greed is a major problem when we are trying to solve the climate crisis, which is a crisis of overconsumption, basically, and a crisis of inequalities. And the third reason is we have designed some instruments because it's evident that climate change cannot be solved by countries alone. You need an infrastructure that is multilateral, agreements that everybody signs to, because it's a global issue. Of course, there is a huge inequality between the countries that are responsible for the highest emissions and the countries that are vulnerable to climate change. And it's, the two sides of the coin. The high emitters have the capacity, the technologies, the resources, and the most vulnerable countries are the poorer countries, the small island developing states, and countries that have serious difficulties in adapting to climate change, in building resilience, and yet they're not responsible for the emissions. And I think that the structure that we have designed is not fit for purpose in a way. Coming for the 28th time, to a conference of the parties, to negotiate this paragraph by paragraph without agreeing on the fundamentals is complicated. And I have been a negotiator. I have been leading my country's climate teams for more than a decade. And at some point, public servants, including myself, bureaucrats, forget the real purpose, why you are negotiating a loss and damage fund, why you are negotiating the Green Climate Fund, why you are negotiating a target for adaptation, because we have a target for mitigation, the 1.5 degrees, we don't have a target for adaptation. It becomes a self-referential issue, and it becomes a power game. And the last thing that we do sometimes is forget the victims of the climate crisis, is forget the almost 100 million climate refugees around the world. And you think that the negotiation is about the negotiation, is give and take, power games, national interests, sometimes high stakes that are being negotiated, and it's about share responsibility. The Convention on Climate Change has a principle that is common but differentiated responsibilities. This principle sometimes is forgotten. And as we sit right now, a few weeks behind the COP28, there is a trust deficit that is eroding the multilateral system on climate change. Why? Let me give you two examples. Number one, already in Copenhagen and then in Mexico, in Cancun, there was agreement to establish the Green Climate Fund and that it was expected to deliver $100 billion per year starting in 2020. We haven't been able to put together the first 100 billion, and we are 3 years late. By now, we should have 300 billion in the basket to support developing countries in their transition to low carbon economies. It hasn't happened. Because of negotiation difficulties in Sharm el-Sheikh, one of the big gains of that Conference of the Parties was the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. Well, great, because it's been in the agenda for developing countries and the small island developing states for the last 15 years. And finally, the Loss and Damage Fund was created. How much money does the Loss and Damage Fund? It's an empty basket so far. If we speak about technologies, low carbon technologies, it's been, believe me, an endless discussion about flexible intellectual property rights for access to low carbon technologies for developing countries.
Maria Fernanda, I find your reference to the $100 billion very interesting. commitments that have not been fulfilled so far. And yet, as you well know, in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, when it was important for especially the high-income countries, right, to protect their populations from the impact of the pandemic, literally trillions of dollars were spent to mitigate the impact of the crisis, right? So obviously, it's not a problem of lacking of the resources, right? When the time comes and when national interests are directly affected, the money all of a sudden appears in a big way. So I find that unfortunately to be an important part of the current reality that we face. But since I mentioned COVID, how did the pandemic impact our perception of policy priorities and the challenges ahead? I raise this issue because, the scientists are saying another pandemic in coming years is not out of the question, because to the extent that the pandemic reflects the kind of economic model that we have, which is a very strong emphasis on growth, we're going to continue to be vulnerable to these kinds of events. And so it occurs to me that we are spending too much on subsidizing energy. You have seen the calculations made by the IMF on the extent of subsidization of coal, gasoline, electricity, other forms of fossil fuels. We're not spending enough on poverty reduction, on financing the transition to a renewable energy economy. Our concepts of national security, it seems to me, are too focused on military preparedness and rather than on concepts of human well-being and basically what is actually contributing to improve the life and the welfare of people. So I know COVID appears sometimes long in the past, 2020, 2021, but thinking a little bit about, the possibility that something like COVID might come back in the future, what are some of the lessons that you see as having been learned from that crisis?
Well, I think that COVID-19 was terrible for humanity, but was also I would say, a story that left some lessons that have been useful at the end of the day. No? First of all, the connection between climate change and environmental degradation is very much connected to pandemics. Most of the recent pandemics have been zoonotic in their origins, which means that they have come from animal species because we have expanded the boundaries of nature. So these crises are not, isolated. They are interconnected. But coming back,
that expansion, in a sense, reflects the kind of economic model that we have, right?
Exactly.
Which
you
has
said
a growth imperative.
Growth.
Yeah.
And basically, when you damage the ecosystems, when you break the harmony between species, when you cross the boundaries, the way of nature to respond to us is through zoonotic diseases, to say, please, respect the boundaries, because the nature is finite, as opposed to what we think. We call them renewable resources. And I don't like the term renewable resources to start with. But coming back to COVID-19, you said something so true. It's not a shortage of money. That's not the problem of humanity. The problem is the priorities, where to invest, how to invest, and who gets the benefits and who gets the losses. And usually, basically, what we do is that a very small minority is allowed to the gains, and the big majorities are entitled to the losses. And that was also true for COVID, not only for climate. And I said it was a major catastrophe because we lost millions of human lives because we weren't prepared adequately, because we didn't have governance-wise the protocols in place. We didn't know how to act, how to react, how to interact, and we didn't have the protections we needed, starting for a supply chains in place, starting for medical infrastructure, health workforce in countries. And in this disaster, and in addition to that, billions put into developing a vaccine. That was one of the big successes, to be able to develop a vaccine in a year. That's a world record, a human history record, in 1 year to develop the COVID vaccine. And what happened with the vaccine? The wealthy countries got the vaccines more than they needed. Vaccine hoarding was the rule of the game for wealthy countries. And still today, in some areas of Africa and other parts of the world, there are some people that have not had access to the COVID vaccines. And basically, the teachings, the lessons learned here is, number one, we realize that we are one human family and we are highly interdependent. We learned that no one was safe until everybody was safe. And that if my neighbor had COVID, my health and my life was in danger. So this sense of vulnerability, of fragility and interdependence, I think it was very good for humanity. It was a wake-up call. Number two, I think that governments, leaders understood that one of the best investments is the investment in primary health care and universal health coverage, and that they needed to be prepared, and investment in health infrastructure was priority number one, because the cost of not having the infrastructure in place was too high, which is also, a good lesson learned. And I think in number three, I think it was also a wake-up call for the multilateral system. For example, that gave birth to the process of a profound review of the international health regulations of the World Health Organization. It gave birth to negotiating a pandemics treaty, so everybody knows what to do in case of a new pandemics. It allowed to establish mechanisms that would counter what happened with the COVID vaccine, and establish a multilateral facilities to treat all countries equally and according to their needs and not according to the money they have. So I think that in spite of the suffering, the loss of lives, of everything, I think we learn the hard way though, but we learn, and I really hope that we learn from that experience to improve the way we act as citizens, as governments, the international system, the UN system, and now we know better, and we should know better, hopefully.
Indeed. It seems to me that hopefully we will use the pandemic as an opportunity to rethink our budgetary priorities in a context of scarce resources throughout the world. Maria Fernanda, you have had, of course, a distinguished career at the United Nations. You were your country's ambassador to the UN. Subsequently, you were president of the General Assembly in 2018. And I'd like for us to change gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the United Nations. As you know, in 2020, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Charter. And as you know, that led to, I thought, very interesting set of conversations around the achievements of the United Nations system, some of the failures, and also a discussion of the possibilities for the future. it seems to me that that conversation was very enriching and certainly bigger in scope than what I remember happened in 1995 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary, even though the 75th anniversary coincided with COVID, as you know, which constrained in many important ways what could actually be done as part of that conversation. To what extent did the 75th anniversary and the associated consultations led to a kind of a clarifying vision of what is the future of the United Nations? It seems to me that perhaps the organization is not yet fulfilled its potential as a catalyst for greater international cooperation and to help us find solutions to some of the problems that we have been discussing. In that context, I also wanted to ask you, is the Summit of the Future in 2024 perhaps an opportunity to use the words of Secretary General Gutierrez to find what kind of future do we want and how do we get there?
Well, I think that when we move around, you have different families of people thinking in different ways. You know, some people even say we don't need the UN anymore. We are okay without the UN. We need to do something else or create a different organization because the UN is not delivering. Others say, well, the UN works pretty well. No, and I think we should keep what we have. And there's another group, which is a middle ground group, that says, recognizes the big achievements of the UN. All the conflicts that we have not seen is because they were prevented. No? And that's why we don't see them. And there are many, believe me, firsthand I can tell you that there are many conflicts that have been prevented. If you look at vaccination around the world, the deployment of the UN in humanitarian crises, not only vaccines, but the services to the refugees, and we can list, an endless list.
You're saying so reminds me of, I think that a much unheralded achievement of the UN system, which is the elimination of smallpox. You know that 2 million people used to die every year through smallpox. So we, in a sense, had a little COVID every year, right? And yet we managed to vaccinate everybody, and by 1980, we were rid of this calamity.
Yeah. It was eradicated. In international law, the laboratory of international law is the UN, and the agreements and the conventions that we sign and the bodies that are out there, starting by the International Court of Justice. And so I would say the factory of international law that regulates international coexistence come from the United Nations. So I think that we should start by acknowledging that. But at the same time, we have to say, this was a system that was designed for a completely different geopolitical context, for a humanity that had different needs at the time, different challenges. And therefore, there is a need for a profound retooling. We need to, the institutions are not robots. They're not self-operating in a way, they're human creations. And therefore, there has to be human political will to make the system change. And when we say reform and change, also there are different degrees. Some people say we need radical change and we reinvent the UN. I tend to agree. There are structural changes that need to happen. No? But at the same time, this should not prevent us for these little gains here and there, and to improve the way, the accountability of the UN, to improve the way citizens participate and monitor and have a say in the way the UN delivers and operates. And when I say the UN, I basically speak about member states. They are the big, the decision makers. They are in control of the organization. It's an intergovernmental body. And at the same time is the UN bureaucracy, the agencies and the programs, and that deliver and operate and act upon the decisions of member states. So a system of accountability, a system of transparency, a system that would measure effectiveness, it's much needed. And these issues sometimes are taken for granted because it's bureaucratic, it's boring, but it's extremely important. When we say, your question included, what should, the summit of the future, what is that we want out of the summit? And I would say we should be ambitious and expect, the highest possible agreement during the summit of the future. I think it's like once in a century opportunity to come up with a bold outcome in terms of the process for a profound retooling of the system, including the organizations that form the system. It is also time to rethink and include in the agenda things that did not exist and challenges that did not exist after the Second World War. For example, the importance of artificial intelligence and the digital world, a new digital compact. There is a process which is in the making of a new agenda for peace. I think the issue of preventive diplomacy, of prevention, of peace building should be at the center of the new agenda for peace. The way the peacekeeping operations are deployed and operate in situations of conflict in different parts of the world, to mention some of the examples, but also there is basically agreement on the need to reform the Security Council of the United Nations. So I would say it's a combination of institutional retooling, an institutional reengineering, which require a lot of technocratic massaging, but after a political decision, in a more profound rethinking of the overall structure, plus a lot of emphasis on accountability and transparency mechanisms, plus the agenda of the new challenges and the new things, like the digital and artificial intelligence, the impact of new technologies, in short, the issue of new scenarios of conflict and peace building and peacemaking. Number 3, the scenario of environmental degradation, because climate is one of the symptoms of the ecological catastrophe that we are experiencing. So the triple planetary crisis that we speak about, it's climate, the extinction crisis that we are experiencing, and the pollution crisis. Pollution is now, you were mentioning health. And one of the main big challenges of the future is how to deal with air pollution and how much it affects human health, for example. So there is a lot in the agenda, and we really need engagement of civil society, engagement of the thinkers and the think tanks and academics and universities and grassroots organizations and the private sector. Because we cannot, this is so important that we cannot leave everything about the reform of the UN in the hands of governments alone. It's a shared responsibility, and in my 30 plus years of experience in the multilateral system, you said it so well, Augusto, it is the first time that I see a big wave, a momentum, a community of willingness, and of saying, yes, it is time for us to rethink the system, and we should use that opportunity.
Maria Fernanda, you are the director of this very interesting organization, Women Global Leaders for Change and Inclusion, that, as I understand it, was set up by former Prime Minister Helen Clark, former Director General for UNESCO, Irina Bukova, and Susana Malcorra, who was Foreign Secretary for Argentina. It seems to me that one can make a persuasive case that the world has suffered a great deal in economic terms and in security terms as a result of the marginalization of women, or her absence in world affairs and in decision making at the highest level. We're coming out of a long period where, in fact, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that in most countries women have been second-class citizens. The statistics are very telling. Of the 193 members of the United Nations, the last time I looked at the data, 11% of prime ministers and heads of state were women. In other words, we're still managed at the highest political level by men. The data on, for instance, the participation of women on corporate boards in the private sector is very, very low. The World Bank has a database that identifies something like 1,600 different forms of discrimination embedded in the laws of 190 countries, which, again, in the 21st century is a bit of a shocking statistic. So tell me, how is the organization that you direct going to help in some way, us, humanity, to move to a situation in which we are better able at tapping the gifts, the capacities, the talent that is embedded in half of the world's population?
Well, I think you mentioned some of the numbers, but every sector of society where you look, there is a huge gender inequality gap. For example, if you look at women in science, how many scientists there are in decision making and in higher level positions. If you look at the health sector, even though women make up for more than 70% of the health workforce, if you look at positions of responsibility, higher level positions in the health sector, they are 80%, they are held by men. So that this, the paradox is so obvious. And some people say, well, women are vulnerable and women are, speak about minority, a minority. Well, first of all, demographically speaking, we are the majority. We're not the minority. And in terms of being vulnerable, it's not that we are vulnerable, but our rights are taken away from us, which is a different, understanding of the situation. And we live in societies that are characterized by what we call transactional inequalities. So in society, if you are a woman, if you are indigenous, if you live in a rural area, for example, if you belong to a particular religious group or practice a certain kind of faith, etc., all of these elements become sources of discrimination. You mentioned that the World Bank has this index of 1,000 ways in which women are discriminated. So the evidence is there. We all know that this is happening. Most countries have the laws, the regulations in place, but we continue not only to maintain the status quo, but there is, according to the latest reports on implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, there is regression on the rights of women around the world. So it's not that when the GDP increases, the situation of women improves, or when we are successful, let's say, on our economic performance, the situation of women improves. Unfortunately, it's not incremental. Unfortunately, in some parts of the world, we're seeing regression in terms of the economic rights, the social rights, the political rights of women, the issue of gender-based violence. It's an issue that is growing around the world. And in some parts of the world, the most dangerous place to be for a woman is her own home. And the aggressors are sometimes inside the houses where they live. And our work of global women leaders is precisely to look at all of this, but from a multilateral international perspective. And our work is to ensure that the multilateral system, the global policy making, the political agreements among member states, the conventions, the efforts towards, for example, reversing climate change or implementing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals on fighting poverty, on access to water and sanitation, or quality education, place women and girls at the center. First, because we are 50 plus of the population. We cannot even think about delivering on Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals without having women at the center. When countries plan and prioritize and invest, basically we are calling, for gender-sensitive budgets, gender-sensitive planning, affirmative action, investing in gender infrastructure that is so much needed. If there is no gender equality, our societies are not going to be sustainable, are not going to be prosperous, are not going to be democratic. And it's not just about having the numbers right. It is about, the rights of women and gender equality being perhaps the most important indicator, for a healthy society, for a healthy democracy. And all of that, when it's translated into the international system, we see that the situation mirror each other. GWL produces a flagship report called Numbers Matter. We monitor the number of women that are in positions of decision making in the international system, and it's shocking. It's shocking to see, that women do not make it to the top positions in the international system. The current Secretary General is a feminist. He has done a great effort to make sure that the senior leadership of the UN is gender balanced, and he has succeeded in doing that. But the middle level positions at the UN, there is still a lot of work to do. If you look at the number of women ambassadors at the UN, if you look, for example, at development banks, the World Bank has never had a woman at the helm, never ever in the entire almost 8 years of history. We have never had a female Secretary General at the UN in about 80 years. When you look at presidents of the UN General Assembly, I am the number 4 in 80 years, and 4 women among 78 74 men and 4 women in almost 80 years. That's really not
it is
enough.
It is a shocking statistic.
So it's shocking because the UN speaks about gender equality, advocates for gender equality, and yet the system itself is not gender equal. So we're doing a campaign about gender alternation for the position of President of the General Assembly. I don't think it's that difficult, just to have a man and then a woman, and respect, of course, the regional rotation. I am the only woman, the first from Latin America, to have had the responsibility of leading the General Assembly. And the 4 women have come from Global South countries. The first, the great Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit from India. Then Madame Brooks from Liberia. The number 3 from Bahrain. And the number 4 from Ecuador. In about, we are approaching the 78th General Assembly. So there is a lot of work to do. And as I said, it's not only an issue of arithmetic fairness, it is an issue of quality. Because, as you said very well, women bring quality, bring different perspectives, bring efficiency, bring results. And it's not me saying it, it's been proven. In the area of peace, for example, we know that when a woman participates in mediating, in peacemaking, in resolving a conflict, usually the agreements are reached faster and last longer. And yet we continue, to address conflicts without involving women in many parts of the world. So there is a whole agenda on women, peace and security. There is still, a huge debt, to deliver and implement the resolutions that we have taken, that governments from around the world have taken. So I would say that the homework ahead is huge. And I think the issue of awareness, the issue of political will, the work we do just to tell the world that we need to really deploy our political, technical policy efforts to close the profound gender inequality gaps and reassert the rights of women and girls around the world.
One of my favorite economists, Amartya Sen, not only did he write very profoundly and compellingly about the role of women in development and the importance of the integration of women into all spheres of economic activity, but he also talked about the importance of broader values and institutions beyond the kind of a profit motive that is the dynamo of our current global economy. He used to quote Adam Smith, where Smith talks about humanity, justice, generosity, public spirit, as being values that are tremendously important to the effective operation of a kind of a equitable, fair economy. Obviously, because of your public roles in government over the years, you have had an opportunity to think about the connection, the linkages between ethics, values, spirituality on the one hand, and economic development on the other. And it seems to me that we need to think about this link more so now than we have thus far, because of climate change, because of poverty and inequality and all these huge problems that we have, which are, in a sense, threatening the stability of our societies, right? Tell us a little bit about how you see this linkage between values on the one hand and economic development on the other.
Well, I think that the ways we have shaped our economies, we tend to confuse means and ends, because basically our material wealth is supposed to serve a purpose, and the purpose should be the well-being of people and the happiness of people. But suddenly, the means and the end are confused, and it's to have, to own, to produce more and more, and to have more. To have more is equated with being happier, and being better. And we know that it's not true in a way. And one of the illnesses of the world of today is the illness of greed and the illness of selfishness. And not only selfishness with the other human beings because of the accumulation of wealth, but also selfishness with other living creatures, including nature. What we have done, we have declared war to nature, directly. There is no sense of guilt or responsibility when we are destroying entire ecosystems, when we are, when we have more than 1 million species that are endangered and that have gone, are endangered or have gone extinct. So it's a human behavior that is self-destroying itself, when we see climate change, for example, or zoonotic diseases like COVID-19, but destroying the environment and destroying itself. So it's very difficult to understand that humans are not exercising this basic instinct of self-preservation. So at the end of the day, the only thing that can save humanity and the planet is to go back to the basics, to the values, to the redefinition of what well-being and happiness mean. You have to measure the well-being, the happiness of the people living in that country. And we come again to the basics, to the principles of respect, of solidarity, of generosity, of intergenerational responsibility, and basically to the very concept that makes us humans, which is the concept of love. Love in the larger sense. I often speak about radical love. Radical love meaning a larger sense of love, meaning care and respect, and each one of us acting knowing that in a no harm principle. If I think that this, whatever I'm doing, is harming nature or another human being, I should refrain. These are, I would say, very basic fundamental principles that we need now to remember and exercise more than ever, because we are reaching a tipping point, a point of no return, if we continue, in the path that we have decided to take, because these are decisions that humans take. Right. Some humans that are powerless, they don't have choices. People that die because of hunger, that don't have access to health services. I think 1.5 million people that don't have access to safe drinking water around the world. They don't have the choice. But the people that have the choice should really cross-correct. Otherwise, we don't have a future.
It seems to me that this is one area where we need to do some serious rethinking. How to essentially have an economic system that promotes growth and prosperity, but does it in a way that is consistent with respect for human rights, gender equality, better distribution of the resources so that we don't have such wide income disparities, and that eliminates poverty. It seems to me it's a scandal that we have close to 700 million people living under the World Bank's poverty line at a time of immense wealth and opportunity, as we have not seen in the past. Maria Fernanda, let me shift gears a little bit. And in an earlier comment you made, you referred to the Security Council. I had the immense privilege of having a conversation last year with Hans Corell, who used to be, as you know, the Undersecretary General in charge of the legal department for 10 years. And one of the issues that we were discussing, and one of the points that he made, is that he said that to address the dysfunctionality of the Security Council, as we have seen in recent decades, it is necessary to promote reforms that would sharply limit the use of the veto. And in the way he sees this, he says that, we would allow the use of the veto when there are credible issues of, let's say, national security at play, right? But we would not allow the use of the veto in situations of, let's say, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and so on. Since, and I want to quote him, he says, in those situations, the use of the veto may violate either the purposes and principles of the UN Charter or other binding treaty obligations. Do you think this is a kind of a useful framework, a useful way of think about how to manage this monster called the veto within the Security Council?
Well, I think that in general terms, when people speak about reform of the Security Council, they immediately think about the members and the permanent members and how to enlarge the permanent members, the number of permanent members and permanent seats, and better representation of the regions, etc., etc. And it's about the numbers and who sits where, basically. And I think that the issue of looking at the working methods in general of the Security Council is as important as the membership, or how and in what circumstances to use or not to use the veto power. And I think that we need to reassess the entire principle of what the veto power means or meant, because it was designed to guarantee that the big powers would not be in war with each other. It was a self-regulating mechanism. If you attack, the veto was to maintain peace among the big powers. That was, I think, that the original purpose of the veto power. But I think that the reality has changed dramatically. So yes, the UN, one of its main missions and objectives is to maintain peace and security, and it should remain like that. But what is the structures that we need to maintain peace and security around the world? This is the fundamental question that we need to address ourselves, and it should be part of the overall conversation of the reform of the United Nations, I believe. It's a larger issue. It's not under what circumstances to use or not to use the veto power. It is about the role of the Security Council, the efficiency and the effectiveness of the way the Security Council prevents conflicts, decides what to do in situations of conflict, and the issue of efficiency, effectiveness, and prevention should be, the ways in which you measure, how good or bad this very important body of the UN system operates.
Young people, as you know, because you have contacts with young people. In fact, I know that in the forthcoming General Assembly Week, the organization that you head, Global Women Leaders, is actually going to have a debate with young people on some of the issues that we face. But young people are greatly concerned about the current state of the world. They are alarmed about what they perceive to be the lack of action on many of these global problems. In fact, I find it very perturbing because there was a time when I had a couple of youngsters in my house to hear sort of increasing evidence coming from the medical community that suggest, for instance, a very sharp increase in anxiety levels and other kinds of psychological stresses, for young people that are apparently linked to concerns about our future and the kind of world in which they are going to be living. And so my request to you is, how does one give young people a little bit of hope for the future, right? One does obviously not want to become a cynic and say, well, these inefficient politicians and other bodies whose responsibility is to deliver solutions are not going to work. Can we get ourselves into a better frame of mind and come up with words of encouragement to young people not to lose hope, so that in fact they become part of the solution to some of the problems that we face?
Well, basically you described very well. There are specialists now, psychologists, that specialize in eco-anxiety, for example, of young people. They are terrified about the future of the planet and climate change, and there is high stress levels related to that and anxiety levels. So there is, eco-anxiety experts now, which should really make us wonder, how bad we're doing. The older generations, we're not doing what we're supposed to do if we have, unleashed this wave of eco-anxiety and in general anxiety and uncertainty and lack of trust, in leaders, in political parties. The Latino Barometro study, I think of 2022, it's not this year's, but 2022 showed that in Latin America and the Caribbean, 8 out of 10 people do not trust political parties. 8 out of 10. And when they list the institutions they trust, parliaments are at the very end of the ladder, governments also down, and in some cases the armed forces and the police are a little higher, and church up here in a way, which means that there is a disenchantment of the current structures and institutions, and that is terrible for younger generations, because if you don't trust institutions, if you don't trust the democratic system that you live in, if you don't trust political parties, what is the future? It's a future of anarchy, but it's a future of self-centeredness. If you don't trust the society and where you live, then there are difficulties, of coexistence, and that's really, it's terrible. And you're saying, but how to infuse optimism? And I think that we specialize on analyzing, the terrible things that happen in our society and all the, perma-crisis that we are experiencing. There is no one speech when you go to a conference or a forum, everybody starts saying we are living multiple and compounded crises, the financial crisis, the climate, etc. That's the way we start phrasing our analysis everywhere. And I think that, number one, we need to know that the younger generations are very well educated, more than ever, because there has been a big influx of people going to university, receiving a good level education, digitally, how do you say, specialized and growing in a different digital era, with the capacity of making changes by themselves. So I know that we don't live in wonderland. It's not, but we have the possibility. We have the tools to make things happen and to make the transformations that are needed. And for that, that's why at GWL we give so much importance to intergenerational dialogue. And it's not coaching or mentoring, it's mutual learning. Because for me, one of the interactions that are more enriching is to talk with younger professionals and younger generations. Of course they're worried, of course they have uncertainty about the future, but we need to really be bold about saying that we do have the tools better than ever before to make the changes that are needed. We have a science that it's more and more sophisticated. We have information. We have technologies that are avant-garde. We have the resources that are needed. We discuss at length how much money there is out there, and they have the intelligence and the talent and the creativity, to do things differently, and they should exercise that, and we should empower them so they can exercise and use the talent, the intelligence. For me, as important as this anxiety about the future, the fear I have, perhaps more than the anxiety part, is indifference. As Elie Wiesel, the Nobel laureate, said, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. Mm-hmm. And we should fight indifference as much as we can, because that's dangerous. When the younger generation turn their backs, and I said, I'm here with myself, basically, in societies of individualistic societies, selfish societies, younger generations that do not commit, that are not politicized in the good sense, that are interested in politics, that are interested on improving the societies where they live. They are not interested, for example, in a spiritual life, in intellectual growth. And I have seen many, and I think that is the real danger, indifference.